and I would like to thank the staff and the fellows of the Commission for all of their hard work in setting up this hearing. In particular, I would like to express my gratitude to Lars de Geer for all of his help. This morning's hearing is extremely timely in light of the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Kyrgyzstan, with potentially serious impacts on the entire region. I would like to applaud the administration for having dispatched the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Michael Posner, to the region, and I understand that our Assistant Secretary of Population, Refugees and Migration, Eric Schwartz, is traveling to the region as well. Central Asia in general is largely kind of an unknown territory for most Americans, and rarely gets in-depth action and attention here on Capitol Hill. All too often we discuss Central Asia merely in the context of our influence in the region, frequently limited to discussions of our military presence, such as our air base in Manas, which we depend upon as staging grounds for our Afghanistan campaign. But by and large, we consider Central Asia Russia's and China's backyard, which very few people truly follow, let alone understand. With the exception of those few experts, the recent pictures of the violence in Kyrgyzstan, which, according to the UN figures, has internally displaced at around 300,000 people and forced nearly 90,000 people to seek refuge in neighboring Uzbekistan, came largely as a surprise to us. We generally had hoped that the democratic reforms and economic development had reached this region after a whole string of democratic revolutions with the former Soviet Union states, and we acknowledge the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. As in other areas of the former Soviet Union, the high spirits of democratic revolutions have given way to the daily realities of politicking, the ever-present disease of corruption, fights over land and water rights, and economic downturns. When opposition forces stormed government offices in April of this year, the government of Kurmanbek Bakajev, which came to power in the 2005 Tulip Revolution, effectively came to an end. Allegations of corruption, nepotism, human rights abuses, as well as discontent over increased energy prices and economic inequality turned public opinion against Bakajev. The opposition was quick to form an interim government led by the former Foreign Minister Rosa Otunbayeva. And I hope I'm pronouncing all these names correctly, but you'll correct me when you testify, who initiated a referendum on a new constitution, which was just held on June 27th, and also promised to hold elections in October. In the June 27 referendum, almost 90% of the voters supported the adoption of a new constitution, and the OSCE issued a statement saying that despite some shortcomings, the referendum was conducted peacefully and in a transparent manner. However, the government has so far failed to exercise control over the south of the country, where Bakajev loyalists have a stronghold. On June 10, riots broke out in Osh, after which a disorder spread to the neighboring Jalalabad region. The government declared an emergency situation and dispatched additional military and police forces to the region. The violence left at least 264 dead and approximately 2,200 injured, though the government estimates that the true number is 10 times higher. Today, the security situation in Kyrgyzstan remains precarious, and there are serious concerns regarding the stability of the entire region. Lawlessness persists in the south, which has created spaces for extremism and criminality. United Nations aid agencies have reported that tens of thousands of Uzbek refugees are returning to Kyrgyzstan homes, which require the UN agencies revise their assistance operation. And so we are glad to have with us today such a distinguished panel of experts which can shed some light on the recent developments and who will share with us some recommendations of measures that we could take to improve the human rights situation in the region and to alleviate the humanitarian crisis that we witnessed as significant numbers of refugees and IDPs are trying to return to their homes, many of which were destroyed, where any kind of infrastructure is now in ruins. So I will recognize our distinguished panel. Jeff Goldstein, who's a senior policy analyst at the Open Society Institute. Rachel Denber, Deputy Director, Europe and Central Asia Division of the Human Rights Watch. Donna Wright, Director, Europe and Eurasia Division of the American Bar Association. And Eric McGlinchey, Assistant Professor of Government and Politics at George Mason University. And we welcome you all here. And why don't we begin with Mr. Goldstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. A significant deficit of human rights and good governance is at the core of the dramatic events we have witnessed in Kyrgyzstan this year. At present, the greatest challenge facing the country is a lack of security, particularly in the south. The recent violence there indicates that the security forces do not have the capacity to assure peace and tranquility, and that the interim government does not fully control those security forces, or at least does not control all elements of those security forces, as some of them are accused of actually participating in the violence. The proposed dispatch of an OSCE police monitoring mission would be a good first step, but the international community needs to do more. First off, an independent international investigation into the violence is essential. Without it, it will be impossible to restore trust among those who were victims of the violence, or to truly recreate intercommunal harmony in southern Kyrgyzstan. Unfortunately, while the international community is ramping up to provide humanitarian assistance to Kyrgyzstan, no country and no international organization appears eager to play a leading role in efforts to provide greater security. And yet, if unaddressed, the current lack of security, combined with the existing deficits in human rights and governance, are a significant threat to Kyrgyzstan's future, and as such, they also threaten vital U.S. interests in the region, including stability in Afghanistan, combating terrorism, promoting democracy, and assuring access to the region's abundant natural resources. It is therefore incumbent on the United States to take a leading role in galvanizing a more robust international response. The Bakiyev regime fell in April when the long-suffering people of Kyrgyzstan ran out of patience with an increasingly corrupt, increasingly authoritarian government that was unable to guarantee them basic social, political, and economic rights. During the 2 months between the fall of Bakiyev and the violence in the south, the interim government in Bishkek struggled both to establish its legitimacy and to effectively govern the country. Sunday's referendum on a new constitution was a step in the right direction, though there are concerns that low voter turnout in the south may leave many feeling disenfranchised, and particularly people of the Uzbek minority. The international community now needs to move forward to work with the Kyrgyz government in order to resolve all the problems associated with the referendum and to ensure that this fall's key parliamentary elections are up to international standards. Under the new constitution approved this Sunday, many powers previously vested in the president will be devolved to the prime minister and the parliamentary majority that he or she will lead. The new government elected this fall will face numerous challenges during its first months in office, which unfortunately for everyone will coincide with winter, which is always the most difficult time in Kyrgyzstan. The United States needs to be getting ready today to provide a substantial program of aid to help the new government demonstrate to the people of Kyrgyzstan that it is capable of addressing their concerns, of protecting human rights, and providing good governance. The United States and other donors also need to increase assistance to Kyrgyzstan's civil society organizations so that they can play their essential role of government watchdog and also of provider of policy recommendations to a government that has very limited policy capabilities of its own. Let me conclude by addressing the question of U.S. policy towards Kyrgyzstan in the 2 years leading up to April 7th and the lessons that should be learned from that event, that experience. Many Kyrgyz, including leaders of the interim government, accuse the United States of sacrificing its values and the good of the Kyrgyz people in an all-out effort to appease the Bakiyevs and prevent them from closing the Manas air base. Critics point out that the United States failed to publicly condemn major human rights violations, including murders of journalists and politicians, failed to provide moral support to the opposition and to civil society leaders, and failed to address widespread concerns in Kyrgyz society that the contract to provide jet fuel to the Manas air base, a contract that last year was worth something like $280 million, was being used to funnel money to subcontractors that were controlled by the Bakiyev family. Administration officials counter that they continue to address human rights violations through private diplomatic channels. They also note the overriding U.S. interest in stabilizing Afghanistan and point out how difficult it was to deal with the Bakiev government. Still, I think if you compare the very brief and tepid press release put out by the U.S. Embassy in Bishkek after the presidential elections in Kyrgyzstan last July with the much more detailed and very forthrightly critical press release put out by the U.S. Embassy in Tajikistan after the bad parliamentary elections there this February, it becomes quite apparent that in fact the U.S. government did pull its punches in Kyrgyzstan and did so in order to try and protect its presence at the Manas base. So what are the lessons that we can learn from this? I would say that first and foremost is that it's a mistake to assume that authoritarian governments are as stable as they portray themselves as being. Convinced that the Bakiev government was firmly in control, U.S. officials decided that they had no choice but to avoid doing or saying anything that would anger the Bakievs. Now, with the Bakievs gone, the widespread perception in Kyrgyzstan that the United States got too close to this authoritarian regime is coming back to haunt the U.S. relationship with Kyrgyzstan, and conceivably could even be a threat to Manas, which is likely to become an issue in the upcoming election campaign. To its credit, the United States government has begun to address some of the problems and shortcomings that marked U.S. policy prior to April 7th. In particular, the decision to announce a new tender for the fuel contract was a good step in the right direction, but it's only a first step. The United States needs to do more. It needs to ensure full transparency of the terms of the new contract, of the contractor, and any and all subcontractors. Moreover, the United States government needs to persuade the Kyrgyz government to implement greater transparency measures on its side, to demonstrate to the people of Kyrgyzstan that U.S. taxpayer money that accrues to Kyrgyzstan is being used for the benefit of the Kyrgyz people and not simply to line the pockets of a few insiders or high government officials. A second lesson to be learned is that while there is clearly a role for quiet diplomacy in addressing human rights problems, there is a significant cost to the United States when it fails to speak out publicly in the face of significant human rights violations. In particular, public silence can easily lead publics overseas, as it has in the case of Kyrgyzstan, to conclude that the United States is hypocritical, that it really doesn't care about human rights issues, particularly in situations where American geostrategic interests are in play. And finally, I think it's essential that the United States apply the lessons it has learned in Kyrgyzstan to its relations with the other authoritarian regimes in Central Asia. While all these countries are different, they all suffer from a significant deficit of human rights and good governance, just as Kyrgyzstan has over the years. Moreover, the two largest countries in the region, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, will be facing in the short to medium-term future a leadership transition. And both of these countries have that inherent instability you have in a country where you have one man who rules, but no rules for what happens when the one man eventually passes from the political scene, as inevitably they will. And I think the conclusion from all this, the lesson from Kyrgyzstan, is that in its relations with all the countries of Central Asia, the United States needs to ensure that human rights concerns are visibly at the forefront of its policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Denver?
Thank you. I'm honored to appear before you today, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the invitation to address human rights crisis in southern Kyrgyzstan and what the U.S. government can do to help address it. Mr. Chairman, Human Rights Watch has been monitoring the human rights situation in Kyrgyzstan for nearly 2 decades, and we've had a research team on the ground in Osh ever since the violence broke out on June 10th. We've documented the massive looting